Carl Jung dedicated decades to studying how our personalities take shape. In his writings on the development of the self, he pinpointed a critical window, the first 5 years of life. But what intrigued him most wasn't so much what happens in those years, but what doesn't. It's an absence so commonplace, so accepted, that most families don't even notice it's there. And it's precisely this invisible absence that builds the narcissistic framework which will define a person's entire life. There's a specific psychological process that needs to unfold between the ages of 0 and 5. When it fails, something breaks in the very formation of the self. A child doesn't develop narcissism because they were spoiled, or because they had too many or too few boundaries. Narcissism arises from something far more subtle and far more devastating. The child simply wasn't seen. And when I say seen, I'm not just talking about physical sight. I'm talking about the emotional mirroring that Jung considered essential for the development of a true self. We're going to explore exactly what happens, or rather what fails to happen before the age of 5 that programs a child to become narcissistic. You'll understand the deep psychological mechanisms behind this formation, and perhaps, by the end, you'll recognize patterns that explain a lot about your own life, because the uncomfortable truth is that most of us carry traces of this primal wound. The only difference is the degree of intensity. Let's start with what Jung called emotional mirroring. In the first few months of life, a baby has no sense of separate identity. They exist in psychological fusion with their mother. It's through the mother's face, her reactions, her tone of voice, that the baby begins to discover who they are. The mother functions as a psychological mirror. When the baby smiles, and the mother smiles back with genuine joy, something profound happens in the infant psyche. The child internalizes, "My joy is real. My joy has value. I exist." When the baby cries in discomfort, and the mother responds with attunement, trying to understand and soothe, another record is formed. My pain matters. My feelings are valid. I am worthy of care. It's through thousands of these micro moments of mirroring that the child's true self begins to take shape. Jung emphasized that this process isn't optional. It's the bedrock upon which a healthy personality is built. Now consider what happens when this mirroring fails, and it can fail in ways so subtle that an entire family might consider them normal. Emily was 8 months old when her mum went back to work. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. The problem wasn't the physical absence. It was what happened when her mom was present. Emily was an expressive baby, reacting to everything with emotional intensity. When something startled her, she would cry loudly. When something delighted her, she would shriek with joy. When she became frustrated, her whole little body would writhe in discomfort. Emily's mom was an intelligent, well-intentioned woman who loved her daughter. But she herself had been raised in a family where intense emotions were seen as an inconvenience. She learned early on to be restrained, controlled, efficient, and without realizing it, that's exactly what she expected from Emily. When Emily cried, her mom didn't mirror the child's emotion. She didn't reflect back with her face and her voice that she understood and acknowledged that feeling. Instead, she immediately tried to make the crying stop. It seems like a small detail, but in the psychology of child development, there's no such thing as a small detail. Each interaction is a brick in the construction of identity. When Emily expressed intense joy, her mom didn't join in that joy. She smiled politely, but her face didn't light up. When Emily showed anger, her mom became visibly uncomfortable and quickly distracted the child with something else. The implicit message that Emily received, thousands of times, was clear. Your emotions are too much. Your feelings are a problem to be solved, not an experience to be shared. By the age of 2, something had already shifted in Emily. She was still a normal child in appearance, but an internal process had begun. Jung would describe it as the beginning of the division of the self. The true Emily, with all her emotional intensity, began to be pushed into the shadow, and in her place, another Emily began to emerge. An Emily who was calmer, more controlled, more acceptable to her mom. But here's what most people don't understand about this process. The child doesn't do this consciously. They don't think, I'm going to hide my true feelings. What happens is much deeper and much more tragic. The child simply stops feeling their own emotions with clarity. They develop what Jung called a false self, a personality built not from what they really are, but from what they perceive they need to be to receive love and approval. At 3 years old, when Emily started preschool, the teachers described her as an easy child. She didn't throw tantrums. She didn't demand attention. She was independent for her age. Her parents were proud. It seemed like they had done a good job. But if you knew how to observe with the eyes of a Jungian therapist, you would see the first signs of something very different. Emily was exceptionally attuned to the emotions of the adults around her. She observed, with an almost disturbing attentiveness, the teacher's face, her mom's tone of voice, and constantly adjusted her behavior accordingly. This isn't emotional intelligence, it's hypervigilance. It's a child who has learned that her emotional survival depends on correctly reading the emotional needs of others and adapting to them. Meanwhile, her own emotional needs are becoming increasingly buried, increasingly inaccessible, even to herself. There's a specific moment that Emily's mom would remember years later in therapy. Emily was 4 years old. She had fallen on the playground and scraped her knee badly. It was bleeding. It obviously hurt. But Emily didn't cry. She simply looked at her mom and said, with a calmness strange for a child of that age, "It's okay, Mom. You don't need to worry." The mom, at that moment, felt a discomfort that she couldn't name. She was proud of her daughter's maturity, but something in that scene was wrong. A 4-year-old who doesn't cry with intense pain isn't demonstrating maturity. She's demonstrating dissociation. And here we arrive at the crucial point that Jung emphasized about the first 5 years. It's not that traumas after this age don't matter. They do. But there's something particularly devastating about wounds that happen before language is fully developed, before the child has the cognitive resources to process what's happening. These wounds don't become memories that you can access and work through. They become structure. They become the very foundation upon which their personality is built. By the time Emily turned 5, the false self was already firmly established. She was the perfect child. Polite, considerate, always eager to please. She received constant praise from adults, and each compliment reinforced the narcissistic structure that was forming. Because these accolades weren't for who Emily really was. They were for the performance she had learned to put on. The true Emily, with her intense emotions and her real needs, was being buried deeper and deeper in the psychological shadow. So deep that Emily herself had forgotten she existed. But hold on. Because what happens next shows exactly how this narcissistic structure manifests in adult life, and why it's so difficult to recognize and treat. Emily grew up to become a successful woman, a lawyer, married, 2 kids. From the outside, an enviable life. But at 32, Emily started experiencing panic attacks. She didn't understand why. She had everything she ever wanted, or at least, that's what she told herself. What Emily failed to recognize was that she had no idea what she really wanted. She had spent her entire life so focused on perceiving what others expected of her and delivering exactly that she had never developed access to her own wants, her own desires, her own authentic identity. Her relationships were functional, but empty. Her husband described her as a perfect partner, but emotionally distant. She fulfilled all the roles: mother, wife, professional, with impressive competence. But he felt like he never truly knew her because there was no accessible true self. Emily's true self was so buried for so long that she herself no longer knew where to find it. And here's the narcissistic aspect of this structure, which is subtle but crucial. Emily had developed a specific version of narcissism that Carl Jung would recognize immediately. It wasn't grandiose narcissism, the kind we see in arrogant and exhibitionistic people. It was what some psychologists call covert or vulnerable narcissism. Emily's self-image as the person everyone can count on, the one who never disappoints, the one who always has everything under control, was as rigid as any classical narcissistic grandiosity. It was an inflated persona, a total identification with an ideal image of herself. And what maintained this inflated persona? The absolute terror of coming into contact with the shadow. Because in Emily's shadow was everything she had repressed since she was a baby. All the anger, all the need, all the real vulnerability. Decades of unfelt emotions, of unmet needs, of unprocessed pain. Coming into contact with that would be like opening a floodgate. And Emily, unknowingly, had organized her entire life to never have to do that. She was a perfectionist to the extreme. Any mistake, any failure, any moment when she wasn't up to her own impossible standards, triggered a shame so intense that it was unbearable. This shame wasn't proportional to the situation. It was disproportional because it wasn't really about the present mistake. It was about the primary wound, that internalized message before the age of 5. You as you are is not acceptable. You need to be different to deserve love. Emily tried therapy periodically, but always gave up after a few sessions. She said that therapy wasn't helping. The truth that she couldn't admit was that therapy was starting to touch on places that she needed to keep closed. When a therapist asked, "What are you feeling?" Emily honestly didn't know how to answer. She could talk about what she was thinking, about what she should be feeling, but real feeling was something so dissociated that she had no access. And here is the tragedy that Carl Jung saw with such clarity. The more Emily tried to maintain control, the emptier she became inside. She was highly functional, but psychologically, she was dying. The true self, unintegrated, undeveloped, screamed from a place so deep that she couldn't consciously hear it. But the scream manifested in the panic attacks, in the growing feeling that her life, despite appearing perfect from the outside, made no sense, in the emptiness that she filled with compulsive work, with perfectionism, with taking care of everyone except herself. Because she didn't know who herself was, this herself never had permission to exist fully. When Emily finally entered long-term therapy, it was because she had a breakdown. She couldn't keep all the balls in the air anymore. For the first time in her life, she failed visibly. And in that moment of crisis, something began to crack in the narcissistic structure so carefully built. It was painful, it was terrifying, but it was also the beginning of the possibility of real healing. The therapist, trained in a Jungian approach, recognized the pattern immediately. She didn't try to make Emily feel better. She didn't praise her for being strong or capable. Instead, she began the slow and delicate work of helping Emily come into contact with all the parts that had been repressed: the anger, the sadness, the need, the vulnerability, all the emotions that Emily's mum had failed to mirror decades ago. And here's what you need to understand about the formation of narcissism before the age of 5. It's not that these people are bad or selfish in the common sense. They are trapped in a personality structure that was built as an emotional survival strategy. They literally did not develop the capacity for genuine emotional self-reflection because they never had their emotions reflected back to them when they were babies. Carl Jung said that the healthy development of the self requires that the child be seen, not for what she does, not for what she performs, but simply for existing. She needs to experience unconditional love, not in the sense that parents never set boundaries, but in the sense that the essence of the child is accepted completely. Her emotions are validated. Her internal experience is recognized as real and important. When this doesn't happen before the age of 5, the narcissistic structure forms as compensation. The false self becomes so developed, so reinforced by years of successful performance, that the person can spend their entire life without realizing that they are living according to a script, not an authentic identity, and the true self, never developed, remains in an embryonic state in the shadow, causing all kinds of psychological and emotional symptoms that the person doesn't understand where they come from. And now comes the most important part, how this pattern is transmitted generationally, because Emily, without doing deep therapy, would inevitably do with her children exactly what was done to her. Carl Jung, his insights, timeless. Let's delve into a critical period, one Jung believed shaped our very core. It all comes down to the first 5 years of our lives. Not epic events, but subtle nuances, often unseen. We're talking about a psychological void, a fundamental absence. A void so common, so accepted, that families rarely recognize it. And it's this absence, this invisible wound, that can set the stage for narcissistic patterns. Patterns that can define an entire life. Prepare for a journey into the hidden forces shaping who we are. A journey guided by the wisdom of Carl Jung. Be ready to confront unsettling truths. And maybe, just maybe, see yourself with new eyes. Consider what happened when Emily's daughter, Lily, just 2 years old, would have emotional outbursts. Lily was an intense child, just as Emily had been before she learned to suppress her emotions. And whenever Lily cried loudly, whenever she showed intense anger or frustration, Emily felt overwhelming anxiety. She didn't understand where the anxiety came from. But Carl Jung would. Lily was expressing all the emotions that Emily had been forced to bury. Seeing those emotions in her daughter triggered Emily's original trauma, that ancient message that intense emotions are unacceptable. So Emily unconsciously tried to calm Lily quickly. She distracted her, changed the subject, offered her something to make the crying stop, exactly as Emily's mom had done with her. The wound was being passed down to the 3rd generation, and probably had been passed down from Emily's grandmother to Emily's mom as well. This is the devastating power of unhealed wounds from the first 5 years. They don't just stay within you, they spread. It was observing her own inability to tolerate Lily's emotions that Emily finally understood the depth of the wound she carried. She saw with painful clarity that she was doing to her daughter what had been done to her. And that moment of recognition was a crucial turning point, because you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. But here's what many people miss about healing this wound. It's not a matter of simply deciding to be different. The narcissistic structure formed before the age of 5 is pre-verbal, pre-cognitive. It doesn't respond to rational decisions. Emily couldn't just decide to access her feelings. She needed something much deeper. She needed, for the first time in her life, to have her emotions truly mirrored. The Jungian therapist became the mirror that Emily's mom couldn't be. When Emily talked about her life, the therapist didn't praise her for being strong. She said, "That sounds exhausting." When Emily described situations that clearly warranted anger, the therapist named it, "You have every right to be furious about that." When Emily minimized her pain, the therapist gently confronted her. "Do you realize you're making your experience seem smaller than it is?" These were micro moments of emotional mirroring. Exactly what Emily had needed at 8 months old, at 2 years old, at 4 years old. She was receiving it at 32 years old, and slowly, painfully, something began to shift. Emily's true self, buried for decades, began to emerge. Not overnight, not linearly, but it began. Emily started to notice sensations in her body that she had dissociated from her entire life. When something bothered her, she felt a tightness in her chest. When someone disrespected her, she felt heat rising in her face. This was emotional information that had always been there, but she had learned not to notice it. Now, for the first time, she was developing the capacity to feel her own feelings in real time. Sounds basic, right? But for someone with narcissism formed before the age of 5, this is revolutionary. And then came a moment that Carl Jung would describe as enantiodromia, the reversal to the opposite. Emily was in a work meeting. A colleague criticized her unfairly in front of everyone, and for the first time in her adult life, instead of smiling politely and absorbing the criticism as she always did, Emily felt anger. Clear, clean, appropriate anger. And she expressed it, not aggressively, but directly. She said, "That's not true, and it's not fair. You owe me a correction." Seems small, but in that moment, something immense had happened. Emily's false self, which always needed to be perfect and please everyone, had cracked. And through that crack, the true self emerged for the first time in decades. She had defended her own reality. She had validated her own experience. She had done for herself what no one had done for her before the age of 5. But now, before we talk about how to identify these patterns in yourself, I want to pause. If this video is resonating with you on a deep level, if you're recognizing patterns you've never named before, you've just received a revelation that most people will never have. The truth about how narcissism actually forms isn't widely publicized because it complicates the simplistic narrative that popular culture sells. But you've just accessed deep psychological knowledge based on decades of work by Carl Jung and Jungian therapists. Creating content like this that explores real psychology instead of shallow formulas demands intensive research. I could make superficial videos that blame narcissists and offer easy solutions. Those videos would get more views, but they wouldn't make a real difference in anyone's life. The super thanks button down there isn't just financial support. It's you saying that deep psychological truth matters more than easily digestible content. It's you investing in content that can actually transform generations. Because when you understand the wound, you can begin to heal it. And when you heal, you don't pass it on to your children. That's the work that breaks cycles. And every time someone uses super thanks, you make it possible to continue doing this deep work. Now, let's talk about how this wound manifests in ways you might not have recognized as narcissism. Because narcissism formed before the age of 5 rarely looks like the stereotype, there's a pattern that many Jungian therapists recognize immediately. The person who's exceptionally attuned to the emotional needs of everyone around them, but completely disconnected from their own needs. This is a classic manifestation of covert narcissism formed by failure of mirroring. The child learned that survival means tuning into others and disconnecting from themselves. So they develop an almost supernatural ability to read people, but they use that ability to adapt, not to connect genuinely. If you're someone who always knows what others are feeling, but never knows what you're feeling, if you're the person everyone turns to for venting, but you have no one with whom to be vulnerable, if you pride yourself on being independent, but secretly feel incredibly alone, these are signs that something fundamental didn't happen before your 5th birthday. Another pattern, paralyzing perfectionism, not the healthy perfectionism that motivates you to do your best, but the perfectionism that prevents you from doing anything unless you can do it perfectly. This type of perfectionism is the inflated persona, desperately trying to hide the shadow. It's the narcissistic structure whispering, "If I'm perfect, if I never fail, then I'll be worthy of love." It's the logic of a 5-year-old, never updated because it formed before you could even question it. And then there's the pattern of compulsive achievement. You amass accomplishments, titles, recognition, but none of it truly satisfies you. You complete one goal and immediately need the next. Because the achievement isn't filling the real void. The void isn't one of accomplishment. It's one of emotional recognition. It's that 8-month-old baby who never had their emotions mirrored, still waiting, decades later, for someone to see who they really are. Carl Jung had a powerful phrase: "It's not the experiences you had that define you, but the experiences you didn't have." And that's exactly the case with emotional mirroring before the age of 5. It's not what your parents did wrong, it's what they didn't do. They didn't reflect your emotions back to you. And without that reflection, you never developed a solid internal sense of who you are. The good news, and Carl Jung always emphasized this, is that the psyche has a natural tendency towards wholeness, what Carl Jung called individuation. Even if you've spent decades living through a false self, the true self never completely dies. It lingers in the shadow, waiting. And when you're ready, when the defenses start to crack, whether through crisis or intentional therapeutic work, that true self can begin to emerge. But I'm not going to lie to you. The process is difficult because all those emotions that were repressed before the age of 5, they didn't disappear. They stayed frozen in the psyche, waiting to be felt. When you start integration work, you're not just feeling present emotions, you're feeling decades of accumulated emotions. It's like a dam that finally bursts, and it can be completely overwhelming. That's why this work usually needs to be done with therapeutic support, not because you're weak, but because you're dealing with pre-verbal, pre-cognitive material that was formed when you were a helpless baby. Trying to process that alone is like trying to perform surgery on yourself. Technically possible, but deeply risky. Then there's the issue of repetition compulsion. Carl Jung observed that unhealed wounds force us to recreate the original wounding situations repeatedly in an unconscious attempt to finally obtain a different outcome. If you experience mirroring failure before the age of 5, you probably find yourself repeatedly in relationships where you're not really seen. You attract or are attracted to emotionally unavailable people, not because you enjoy suffering, but because your unconscious is trying to resolve the original wound. Real healing begins when you stop trying to resolve the wound through others and start doing for yourself the mirroring you never received. This means learning to validate your own emotions. When you feel anger, instead of immediately judging it or repressing it, you stop and say, "I have a right to feel this." When you feel sadness, instead of trying to quickly cheer yourself up, you allow the feeling and acknowledge, "This sadness is real and important." It sounds simple, but for someone who's spent their entire life disconnected from their own feelings, this is revolutionary. It's literally rebuilding the foundation of your personality. It's doing it 30, 40, 50 years old. The psychological work that should have been done before the age of 5. Going back to Emily, after 3 years of deep therapy, she was a fundamentally different person, not in the sense that she had become someone else, but in the sense that she was finally becoming herself. The true self, repressed since infancy, was integrated. She knew what she felt. She knew what she wanted. She was able to set boundaries without paralyzing guilt. She could be vulnerable without feeling threatened with annihilation. And most importantly, she had broken the cycle with Madison. Emily was now able to tolerate her daughter's intense emotions. When Madison had outbursts of anger or sadness, Emily didn't try to make it stop immediately. She sat with her child, reflected the emotion back. "You're very angry right now, aren't you? That must be hard." And through that mirroring, Madison was developing what Emily never had, a solid, true self, capable of feeling fully and still feeling safe. 3 generations of wounding, finally interrupted, not because Emily became a perfect mom, but because she did the work of integrating her own shadow, of healing her own wound, and healed wounds aren't transmitted. So, if you're recognizing these patterns in yourself, what can you do? First, understand that recognition is already the first crucial step. You can't heal what you don't see. Second, seriously consider therapy with someone trained in deep work, preferably with knowledge of Carl Jung or developmental psychology. This is not work for superficial cognitive therapy. You need someone who understands pre-verbal wounds and knows how to work with material that is below conscious awareness. Third, start practicing body awareness. Your emotions are being felt in your body, even if you don't have conscious access to them. Learn to notice sensations, tightness in your chest, a knot in your throat, tension in your shoulders. This is emotional information. The more you practice noticing, the more access you'll have to your real feelings. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, develop self-compassion. You were wounded when you were a helpless baby. It wasn't your fault. You developed narcissistic structures not because you're a bad person, but because you were a child trying to survive. All the rigidity of your persona, all the perfectionism, all the emotional disconnection, all of it was a survival strategy that made sense at the time. It may not serve you anymore, but it deserves compassion, not judgment. And finally, understand that healing is not linear. There will be days when you feel deeply connected to yourself, and days when the false self returns with full force. This is normal. The narcissistic structure formed before the age of 5 had decades to consolidate. It's not going to disappear in weeks or months. Individuation, the Carl Jungian process of becoming who you really are, is a lifetime's work, but it's work that is worth every moment of difficulty, because on the other side of that integration is something you've never experienced before. The sensation of existing as yourself, not as a performance. The ability to connect genuinely with others, not just to adapt to them. And the freedom to transmit emotional health to the next generation instead of wounding. Those first 5 years, they really set the stage, but they don't define everything. With awareness, with deep work, with the courage to confront your shadow self, you can rewrite the script that was imposed upon you when you were too young to choose. You can finally develop the true self that was never allowed to fully exist. And when you do that, you're not just healing yourself, you're healing generations. Carl Jung knew this, and his work provides a roadmap. Now I want to hear from you. Type mirror in the comments if you recognize that you weren't seen emotionally before the age of 5. Type Type cycle if you've realized you're repeating patterns with your children, patterns that were done to you. And type healing if you're already doing deep therapeutic work to integrate these wounds. I'm going to read all the comments. And if you want me to delve deeper into a specific aspect of the formation of narcissism in early childhood, let me know here. Your comment might just become the next video. Carl Jung's insights can truly help us understand these complex dynamics.